In philosophy, there is a divide between continental philosophy and analytical philosophy. Some people say that this isn't really a divide, it's just a difference in approach. But that's the point. It is that difference in approach that creates the divide. Some analytical philosophers are fond of saying that they work within the analytical tradition. And the word tradition is very appropriate there because analytical philosophy is an approach of working within a set of canonical texts and canonical methodologies. A few years ago, Neil Levy wrote a very good paper that described analytical philosophy as philosophy conducted within and confined within a paradigm, whereas continental philosophy is much more open. And within these two approaches, there are strengths and weaknesses. And this is very true. Both analytical and continental approaches to philosophy offer something very valuable to us in philosophy, but both have some very real weaknesses. How I describe the difference in the approaches of continental and analytical philosophy is to say it's the difference between process and positivism. There were two schools of philosophy that went by the names process philosophy and logical positivism. And while those two terms only apply to very specific movements within philosophy, it does say a lot about this difference in approach between continental and analytical. So what do I mean by process versus positivism? Well, let's look first at the analytical tradition and approach to philosophy. Analytical philosophy has its roots, ironically, in the continent. And of course, that's what continental philosophy, as the epithet created by analytical philosophy, is all about. Analytical philosophy has, as we shall see later, predominantly been associated with an Anglo-American school of philosophers. And they're saying that, oh, the continentals, they're on the continent in Europe, they're doing something that we don't do. Nevertheless, analytical philosophy has its roots in rationalism. That was a continental European tradition begun by French philosopher René Descartes. Rationalism, as a philosophical approach, said that we can know what is true through the exercise of our reason, and therefore the way to truth is logical, rational analysis of our thought. Rationalism was advanced by the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who developed ways of applying logic to our language in order to bring us closer to truth and the type of certainty of our knowledge and our thoughts that we find within mathematics. And so Leibniz was very much an admirer of mathematics, geometry, and the precision and exact knowledge that you can have from those schools of thought, as was Descartes. Descartes thought that logic, mathematics, algebra, these must form the foundation of all of our thinking. So Leibniz applies that as well, as do a number of philosophers in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s in continental Europe. Positivism, as we know it today, comes into play with the French philosopher Auguste Comte. Comte used the term positivism to describe what he thought philosophy should aspire to. Positive knowledge, absolute, certain knowledge that is completely devoid of speculation and superstition. Again, that's not a new idea. That's been in the rationalist tradition for a while now. And in fact, you can go back to the ancient Greek philosophers and see a very similar idea. But Comte's conception of a positivist philosophy is colored by his deep hostility towards religion. He thought that religion was the worst thing to ever happen to humanity, and that his positivist philosophy would eradicate religion, and of course eradicate religious thought and belief. Therefore, Comte said, all speculation, all thought that does not conform to logic is to be dismissed. And that includes even thinking within the sciences. He rejected, interestingly, a lot of the science of his time in the 1800s because he thought it was too speculative. He even rejected Isaac Newton, who used modeling and theory to come to, well, understanding of gravity and motion, but Comte said no. So Comte's positivism of only positive knowledge is reducing everything in human thought to the hard sciences, logic, mathematics, physics, and so on. Although he does suggest, Comte does, that there should be a new science that is a logical study of society, which he called sociology. And indeed, Comte is the father of sociology. Comte's suggestion is that all human behavior, all of human society, can be analyzed like you would study physics or chemistry, and we would then uncover the materialist laws that determine human behavior, just like we would see the materialist laws that determine things in a test tube. Comte's idea did indeed inspire the field of sociology, but more importantly, it inspired a particular approach to doing sociology and all the social sciences. There are, of course, continental social science and analytical social science. The bottom line here for Comte is that only positivist knowledge, only a positivist approach that is firmly, solidly grounded in logic and logical analysis of science is permissible. And yes, this has the flavor of religious dogma, of which Comte is aware and quite unironically accepts, because he sees what he's doing as a new religion. He does use that term, a scientific religion that will replace the old religions. What we see in analytical philosophy, even to this day, and even among those people who aren't specifically adopting Comte's particular approach to positivist philosophy, is this sense of we're working within a tradition where we have certain canonical texts and canonical methods that we apply with the understanding that knowledge is ultimately determined by what our rational analysis is. The foundation of positivist analysis was taken up by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell is where the idea of analytical tradition as opposed to continental tradition comes from, because Russell was a very English philosopher. He was English gentry who inspired many philosophers, and thus the analytical tradition became associated with Anglo-American English language philosophy. Like Comte and Leibniz before him, Russell's great love was mathematics, and he believed that mathematics was grounded in logic. He got that idea from, again ironically, a German philosopher named Gottlob Frege. Frege invented a new system of logic that we now know as symbolic logic that allows us to analyze our words, our terms, our sentences. And Frege argued that mathematics was not some sort of separate mystical entity, but merely an extension of logical thought. All mathematical laws and proofs, then, are to be understood as pure logic. And Russell loved that idea and thought that that idea can be converted into a system by which we can analyze all human thought, all scientific discovery, by subjecting it to logical analysis. So what Russell did was he took Frege, and with his professor Alfred North Whitehead, Russell wrote a formal system of the logical foundations of mathematics. Russell and Whitehead published in 1910 to 1913 a 3-volume set called the Principia Mathematica, the Principles of Mathematics. It is probably the most dense book ever written. Here, for example, is their proof that 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's okay, I don't understand it either. 99% of the people on the planet don't understand it either, but the 1% who do say this is really good stuff, and we'll just have to take their word for it. The point here is that Russell is saying that we know that 1 plus 1 equals 2, not out of some sense of intuition, which is subjective, but a logical knowledge that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now, why that's important for Russell and for many analytical philosophers today is that if our knowledge of mathematics is based in logic, then all human thought that could be said to be true also is based in logic. And logic being objectively true and absolutely certain in its assertions of truth, logic forming the foundation of mathematics means that mathematics, which is the foundation of physics and science and physics being a reading of the world and how the universe actually is, then everything that is objectively true in the universe can be properly understood as absolute truth if it's subjected to logical analysis. Simple, right? And I won't get into here Russell's work on all of that because it's a very large and complicated topic, but Russell said that everything can be described as a kind of logical atomism where every thought that we have corresponds one-to-one with an atomic fact in the world. And this doesn't mean literally atoms, it just means indivisible units of logical thought. And this basic idea was picked up by a group that called themselves the logical positivists, taking Russell's idea of pure logic, Frege's ideas of pure mathematics and logic, and Comte's ideas of positivism, and saying that indeed, yes, we can and should, most importantly, should subject all human thought and all human language to a method of rigorous logical analysis. Ironically, again, these logical positivists were called the Vienna Circle because they were all based in Vienna, Austria. And the logical positivists said that we must reject all statements that cannot be verified in experience. So if I say there is a tree next to the driveway, that is a meaningful statement because it can be verified as being either true or false by you going to the driveway and observing whether there is a tree there or not. The meaning, the logical positivist said, of any factual statement is the method of its verification. And of course, that means science and scientific observation. That eliminates, in the eyes of the logical positivists, any statement that cannot be subjected to this type of scientific analysis of testing and verification. And that sounds really good at first glance. The problem, of course, is that as science tells us, yes, we have all these observations, but even the laws of physics themselves cannot be verified through observations. They can only be supported by observation. And as Russell found later in his work, this whole idea of logic is unverifiable itself. Again, logic is supported by our use of it, but we can't prove logic. And this gets a little weird because it seems a little bit beyond our power of words to describe, which is another deep irony of this all. But Russell's student, Ludwig Wittgenstein, eventually concluded that no, logic cannot be proven, and he kind of showed that this is the case. We accept logic because we just accept logic. It works for us. And then that brings in a whole other set of messes. And the logical positivists eventually had to end their project because they realized that the foundations of their project were unsupportable by anything other than pure intuition of we think this works. Russell abandoned his project saying that it doesn't work. And then when subatomic physics and quantum mechanics came along, logical positivism completely melted down. And they had to admit that the verifiability principle can only at best be a recommendation, a good approach. And indeed, that's all analytical philosophy is. It's an approach. It works in some instances. It doesn't work in other instances. But the demand, the almost religious, dogmatic demand that all human knowledge conform to a specific structure is ultimately an empty demand. Analytical philosophy doesn't entirely work. It does not live up to its promise. Does that mean it's worthless? No, absolutely not. The analysis of language, the logical analysis of the words that we use and the way that we use words is absolutely necessary. It is when people don't subject their thoughts and their words to a logical, rigorous analysis that we get all kinds of crap. So does that mean that continental philosophy is the preferred approach? Well, continental philosophy has some very serious weaknesses as well. Mostly in that if you do say we reject a paradigm, we do not allow ourselves to be constrained by logical thought and logical analysis, then that does mean you can go off the deep end. And indeed, some philosophers who could properly be considered within the Continental tradition have indeed done that. Continental philosophy has its roots in George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel saw history as process, as an ongoing happening, and even philosophers today who would call themselves continental, who aren't directly doing Hegelian philosophy, are deeply influenced by that conception, that approach of what philosophy should do. And this difference between process and positivism is perhaps best described by the French philosopher Henri Bergson. He was active in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and for a number of decades he was the single most famous philosopher in the world. But he is largely forgotten because the Anglo-American analytical tradition of philosophy, which dominates academic philosophy today, has incorrectly dismissed Bergson as mere speculation because it doesn't fit in their paradigm of what philosophy should be. Regardless, Bergson has a lot of very interesting and valuable ideas, which I cannot go into here, but it is appropriate to describe how Bergson explains the analytical and continental divide. Bergson said that there are two methods of gaining knowledge of any object. And he's thinking here in terms of both science and just our everyday observation of an object. The one method of analysis is how science and analytical philosophy think knowledge has to be obtained. And it is a very habitual way that Western people have learned to think. And that is the method of analysis. Analysis is the approach based on two assumptions. One is that how objects are in the world are as they are, and two, that we can have knowledge of these objects as they are. And these are two big assumptions about objectivity. There is objective truth out there, and we can have objective knowledge about them. And analysis, Bergson says, is the method that comes from these assumptions. Analysis is detached and disinterested in its method of separating the object from its surroundings, conceptually breaking down an object into parts, interpreting the divided parts, and reconstituting a view of the object after analysis. Because, of course, the assumption is we can do this. But, Bergson says, analysis depends on symbols that represents parts of the objects. But these symbols are simply words and mathematical equations that we have created. They're human creations. And Bergson says that these human creations are barriers between us and reality. Therefore, this allegedly detached and objective method of looking at objects in the world, studying objects in the world, taking them apart and understanding them in that way is not really empiricism, despite the fact that we think that it's empiricism and have thought that it's empiricism for centuries. Bergson says the true empiricism is what he calls intuition. And he's using the word intuition very differently than other philosophers. Bergson's use of intuition is as a sympathetic entering into what is observed, not pretending that we are looking at the world from outside the world. We are within the world. We cannot escape being within the world. There is no privileged standpoint outside the world by which we get a God's eye view of it. By sympathetic, Bergson does not mean any type of emotional attachment, but it is a way of operating through affinity with and understanding our interdependence with the objects in the world. It's similar to the concept of a sympathetic vibration of two strings. If you pluck one string in an instrument, it will sympathetically cause another string in the instrument to vibrate. Bergson's idea of intuition, then, is entering into an experience, acknowledging that we're already there, we're already part of the experience that we have, that we're bringing something to, we cannot help but bring something into this experience. And so our observations about anything is not objective, but an ongoing process of experience. Intuition is an integral experience, a series of actions, a series of experiences. And so the method of understanding the world in continental philosophy, in process philosophy, is to understand all of this. We are part of what we are experiencing. We bring something to the experience, as does every other human being bring something to their experience. And this idea of a perfect, objective, perfectly pristine, logical experience of anything is a false notion. It's a, dare we say, a superstition, a chimerical belief that it is possible to capture reality within my words, within my logic. One of the examples that Bergson gives of this difference between process and positivism is the experience of a city. You can look at photographs of a city, absolutely. Even if you've never been to a city, you can look at photographs of it, even video of it. You could look at a collection of photographs of a city taken from every possible viewpoint, from every possible perspective. But even with all of that, you can't reconstruct what it is to be in that city. Only by entering the city and walking through it can you grasp what it is to be in that city. Bergson's other example is you could read a commentary on a poem or work of fiction, but no matter how many commentaries you read, you will never be able to grasp the value of experiencing the poem, the novel, the person, unless you go into its original state, unless you actually read it. And if the work was written in a foreign language, in translation, you will never capture the full meaning and experience of that poem or novel unless you do so in its original language. So analysis can give us photographs and commentary, but it can't give us the experience of the things themselves. Analysis has value. Analytical philosophy has value. It provides us with some essential understandings of how things are and how we think. But Bergson is correct. Knowing the things themselves, how objects are, what objects are, requires this type of sympathetic entering into experience that he calls intuition, but which most philosophers now just simply call, well, living life, being within the world. Bergson believed that through this intuition we can, in his words, seize reality from within. And there are philosophers who follow in a Bergsonian view of things that promise some sort of grand knowledge of the things themselves, of how things really are, through this kind of intuitive process. Most continental philosophers would not go that far, but all continental philosophers worth anything would definitely agree with this basic approach of rejecting the false idea of objective knowledge, detached knowledge, and understanding that history, society, and even science itself can never have this perfect, pristine, God's eye viewpoint. We are human beings. We are embedded in a world. We are embedded in a society which is constantly changing, constantly, well, in process. The only way that we can understand our world is to understand our world as a process in which we are existing and of which we are a part of. And all the logical analysis in the world isn't going to help us to understand a process fully. Still, we do need logical analysis. We do need analytical philosophy. But as William of Ockham said way, way back in the 1300s, logic tells us nothing about the world. Logic only is a relation of ideas. My view is that the strength of analytical philosophy is the tools that it provides to us, but that the weakness of analytical philosophy is that it mistakes the use of a tool for knowledge. Hammers and saws are great, and hammers and saws are necessary to build a piece of furniture. But hammers and saws, in and of themselves, cannot build a piece of furniture. You need a vision, you need a process. Continental philosophy, its strength is understanding the world as process, the world as it exists, and understands us as being a part of the world, not detached from the world. A judicious use of the tools of analytical philosophy, an application of basic reasoning, critical thinking, logic, to a process approach to the world will hopefully lead us to greater understanding and rein in the excesses of fly-away believe-anythingism continental philosophy. Ultimately, the purpose of philosophy is to make our life and our society better. And logic chopping doesn't accomplish that. Process accomplishes that, because process is meeting reality and people where they live.